think one thing that we have to understand why we don't have that, it's quite important to look at the political economy of economics.
Right.
Because we have health economics and we have development economics, and even welfare economics, and these are three disciplines that kind of aren't really considered economics. They kind of.
I beg to differ.
They are considered I would say they are economics. They should be considered economics. But in my undergraduate syllabus at UCL or wherever, they're pushed way outside, and they're not. And if you look at I don't know, Hajun Chang, who's one of the world's premier economists. He's in the development department at Cambridge, and he's a member of the economics faculty, but he's not allowed to teach. And there's loads of examples like that, and even SARAS, which is really progressive, has a quite separated development and economics department, and kind of development economics gets treated as this whole separate discipline in a lot of ways, and especially in the teaching, and so I think one of those things, and it's been sort of time and time again, kind of our friends at the post-crash in Manchester bring it up a lot, especially how kind of the way that the economics as a discipline is funded, and the way the research assessment exercises function, and the type of economics you have to do to get treated as a proper academic, kind of means that these sorts of actually really valuable work is pushed to the side, and in a way that means they're not incorporated back into the discipline. And I think that's where philosophy of science is powerful, because it's become something where you have it's an ethics. It's not just it's a practice, not just a.
Well, this is where I'd see where I see the point of behavioral economics, because in terms of its foundations, the work I do is about taking the ideas from psychology mainly, but you do bring in some sociological issues as well, and try to put them into how we make choices on behalf of people. So if you're a government, you have to be benevolently rational towards the people you're acting upon, or else you're just kind of either making up an idea of what they want, or you're a tyrant or whatever like that. So you try and, so within that, and within behavioral economics, what I see as the philosophy behind it, is the important thing behind it, is that the empirical, proper experiments, human experiments being done, insofar as we can carry them out properly, are the last word, not how internally consistent your system is, which has been kind of the last word within economics for a long time. And so, in that sense, within health economics and welfare theory within that we're attempting to put an empirical foundation to it. And so that will kind of force it into the mainstream, or the mainstream can admit, sorry, we don't like empirical data, we don't believe with your justification system, but that will be a criticism of itself, and that can't be sustained. So I'd be hopeful in that regard.
It sounds like what you're doing is really interesting. But again, I would just emphasize the need to not necessarily take on board ideas from other disciplines, but to be aware of the limitations of the economic approach, essentially. So I made the approach of maximization of whatever you're maximizing. I mean, it's fundamental, it's not as though you can't hypothesize it and test it and see if it works and see if it's a good fit. You can absolutely do that. I think it's good to do that, so long as you recognize that it's a particular methodological approach amongst others.
As an alternative to maximization, you could have the idea of a decent minimum.
Okay.
Something that instead of maximizing the good, where you could have 10 persons, one of them gains massively, and then everybody else doesn't get anything, or you could have a decent minimum whereupon everybody must get to that level. So that's a completely valid way of applying, say, the ideas of send. And you can't empirically test which one of those is better, because that requires an assumption about the ethical foundations of it. But that you kind of run up, that's where the technocrats, as a technocrat, you run up against the almost unknowableness of some ethics. My kind of egalitarian sort of bent would be, decent minimum, probably the way to go. But for me to justify that beyond my gut feeling would be quite difficult.
Yes.
Mine's not really a practical intervention on how syllabuses could be more
Fair enough.
It's more just a kind of thought I had, a reflection on say some of the neoliberal assumptions you could get over. Say everyone was totally smart and just super smart. Someone said before, younger people, you couldn't say they had the same level of intelligence or experience. And say we all had perfect information as well, we all knew that there was horse meat in our beef or whatever. I was wondering whether, I don't know if this makes sense, but whether it's actually possible to be rational in the sense that, first of all, like, rational for who? Like, for yourself or for everyone or for just your family? Like, what's the unit? And they would be in conflict with each other sometimes. And secondly, say you can decide on a unit, and say that's, for example, yourself. Well, then there would be contradictory things in life all the time. I'm sorry, I'm sure it says this in all the literature, like I said, I'm not an economist, it's just a reflection. But, like, so perhaps rationality doesn't even exist because something, I don't know, let's just say you make a rational choice to eat some beef, which might be good because it gives you some B12, but it might also have something in it that's bad. And that will happen on a massive scale, so perhaps rationality isn't even possible.
Good point. I noticed you were trying to say something.
Point is follow-up to the discussion about maximization.
Brilliant, good.
I think, and this is maybe a minor point, but I think we need to distinguish between maximization as a criterion for good outcomes, which I think is what you were discussing, whereas I think the point being made over there was about maximization as a model of human behavior, right? And which I agree is a kind of fundamental thing, which isn't part of the economic approach is kind of founded on that. That's how we do that kind of thing. I think maybe political science is a good example of a discipline which is more closed, right? Because you have the rational choice people who have taken that from economics, but you've got people doing discourse theory at the other side of political science, right? And you've got people in the middle who are trying to borrow from both. So I don't know whether economics should try to be like that, because maybe it wouldn't be economics. But it's possible to jump between different models and be kind of nimble in that kind of way.
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of an interesting point. You think that if economics gave up on those certain sorts of assumptions, it ceases to be economics?
It could be argued.
It's quite a claim.
We're economists. This is what we do. It's not our job to think about how we talk about economics.
Okay.
That's for sociologists and anthropologists. But we should listen to them. So we should do that. Or you could say, no, we should learn to do that too.
Okay.
I don't know which is the right answer.
I think, to reply that, I think what's funny is that we define economics as the study of how resources are allocated. But so many economists are trying to use that approach to explain human behavior. I think there is a book called The Economic Approach to Human Behavior by, I don't remember. But I think if economists stay where they are, it's fine. I don't know, but so often economists are trying to use their approach to human behavior. So if they try and do that, it's fine, but they have to take into consideration other factors as well if they want to do that. So, I don't know.
It's more than just sort of economists are going beyond that. They're effectively guiding policy. They're out there making political decisions for all of us on the back of all of these sorts of assumptions. So there's quite a lot of baggage which they need to account for, or at least be able to justify. So I'm not sure how easy it will be for economists or economics to step back. I'm sorry, yes, you were saying.
Follow up on this idea of maximization, particularly in this context of covert ideology. I think, well, it's disguised as a positive science, isn't it? A mathematical science.
Yes.
That's amoral. Not immoral, not immoral, but amoral.
Yes.
In fact, it is a particular ethics. It's a utilitarianism. You're judging actions by their consequences. And could it not be conceivable to have an economics that isn't based on utilitarian ethics, but it's based on another ethics, like virtue ethics, where your criteria for your action is not what's maximising profit, but what's just or what's wise.
Exactly.
It could still be economics, couldn't it?
Yeah.
It's just we would have a rather different shape to it than a mathematically based utilitarian.
Good question. Yeah. Sorry, you haven't spoken yet, so brilliant.
Well, the thing is I'd say with the neoliberal kind of view on things is that it ties quite nicely in with, say, Darwinism and science. And it's all it's quite, I don't know, it's quite cozy, so it sort of I'd say a lot of people would say, when you come to saying like another moral system for guiding, a lot of people, you'd meet this wall of people saying, well, humans aren't like that. Humans don't want to, and I think that's the big problem. And because I'm sure most people can identify these traits in themselves, where they would do something selfish rather than help someone else, and it kind of relies on that to, I would have done that as well. So it's kind of fine, So I don't know. I don't know how you'd go about breaking that idea, and whether you could. I'd like to think you could, but I don't.
Okay. Kat?
I
Yes.
guess there are examples in the past of where things have seemed like absolute truth and then have been deconstructed and worked out. So sort of slavery and rights against women, for example, have been key examples of that. But I guess moving it forward a bit in terms of what Eliane was saying earlier about this idea of actually needing to put it out into the open and say we have to question this for it not being truth. And the minute you start questioning, whether it's in your classroom, whether it's in a response to an academic journal, whether it's on BBC News, if you get the opportunity, wherever, just saying this is not truth. This is how we can question it. And if you can start questioning it, then you can bring in the opportunity for a virtue ethics approach or a Marxist ethics approach or whatever approach it is you choose, because you're pulling it out and saying this isn't an amoral scientific system, it is a belief system that rests on certain assumptions, like all ideologies do. This is one ideology that's in existence, but it's not the only one, and actually start constructing alternatives, which the left is terrible at doing. It says how awful neoliberalism is, and then what do we do instead? Sorry guys, leave that to other people to work out. But actually start building, like, okay, so if it's not based on rationality, if it's not based on irrationality, what is it based on? What is the outcome that we're hoping to get? If it's not a perfectly working economic model, what is it? And go from there.
Okay, sorry, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was really quite surprised to hear before that you don't even get like names in your lectures of who the people are that are saying these things. Ours is taught pretty much like as if it was philosophy or something. This is one person's model, and we get usually, say we did agriculture and development last week. We got this is what the neoliberal sort of model is. This is what Kaiying is, and this is the Marxist one, right. and that's how lectures kind of go. So I think that would be really good, and I'm having not done economics before, I think I would have really seen a big difference between the way it's done.
See, that's what the heterodox utopia looks like, right there. It's over there in SOAS. Brilliant. Okay.
But the other thing I was going to say is regarding Darwinism, I totally agree that first of all, there are ideas that can be deconstructed, but furthermore there are gains that people never thought could be won. So not only ideas can change, but reality can. But on a evolutionary biology point, there are many people who not even say that Darwin was wrong, but say that Darwin didn't look at the whole picture, and that while we might be selfish in some ways or whatever, we're also, society to exist has had to be cooperative. And using examples such as using game theory, using biological examples, using different theories actually, and one example being like people who throughout history have risked their lives to save someone else that's not related to them. And one good book is called Super Cooperators by Martin someone, I think. But there is a lot of literature out there, and like Kat said, you can deconstruct these ideas, and while that is a wall at the moment, it's maybe a wall that can come down.
Well, actually, Darwin himself said, I think he was talking about, I think it was about eugenics or something, and he was saying, or how actually humans might decide to not help other human beings, but then he said, but that would also be sacrificing the noblest part of our nature. So I think he accepted that actually human beings aren't necessarily as bad as his model says they are. I mean, I'd say on the whole, like on a day-to-day level, most human beings are quite good. And so I don't know if you could build a system based on that, what seems to be more common. I don't know, helping someone onto a bus, someone with their shopping or something. Then that might be breaking that wall. I don't know.
Eliane?
Yeah, and it's just really interesting hearing the comments about science. It does seem to be a recurring theme about the abuse of science, really, and the extrapolation of science into areas where it doesn't really belong, and also a kind of a fundamentalist approach to science, which, as you say, the science itself, properly understood, has a methodology and a philosophy, but when it's extrapolated, it loses all of that, and it becomes this sort of truth. And we see that in so many areas of our culture now, this kind of scientisation of our culture, which, we're talking about interdisciplinarity, and actually the scientism that's pervading all disciplines, from economics to literature to film studies. It's a sort of colonising discourse, which is actually sort of doing away with the valuable interdisciplinarity, which comes from saying, comes from a sociological perspective where you can actually see how science operates as a mode of belief. So it's a corrosive scientism that sort of stops us being able to come from other disciplines and see economics and see science in a sort of objective perspective. And I think, and I suppose, and I really welcome this discussion about, trying to identify schools of thought in economics and individuals who have come up with economic ideas and identify them as schools of thought as such. But I suppose, coming back to framing, I suppose that's another slight concern I have with framing, is that framing is also founded on science, and the values, and it's a slight tangent, but the values and frames approach comes from a scientific insights of social psychology and so on, and it's not an ideological or an idealistic model, it's a scientific model of psychology and about how we are as humans. And and again, it just reminds me of this sort of reductive behaviourism that I can't quite get on board with it for that reason, that I want to sort of remain in the ideological arena in a good way. Ideology is good if it's overt.
If I could get in just on that very point, because that's kind of what I was getting at earlier. If we accept that there's going to be, that we'll have some sort of collective action, be that the name of your state, government, whatever, commune, doesn't matter. You're going to have you're going to act, and your actions will imply at least some ethics and some beliefs about the world.
Yeah.
So if we're going to have, in any sense, some sort of benevolent rationalism, we'll need a science of what those entities want that we wish to act upon, and that we're acting in their best interest. And so this is where I have trouble with the accusation of scientism, because, or it was a naive interpretation of what scientism it might be, but it necessarily, if we're going to at least accept any hope of some sort of good collective action, we need to accept some sort of good truth.
Well, I believe in empiricism, so...
But isn't that scientism?
No, that's scientific method properly understood, which I'm totally fine with.
But is that not within this ideology of belief, though?
Well, because empiricism is a scientific method that is necessarily self-reflexive about its own methodology. That's the great virtue of scientific method, that it obsessively looks for biases and partisan assumptions in its own process, and that's why I like science, right? Yeah. But and I'm in favour of NICE, for example, and the kinds of calculations. Right, good. Well, then we agree on that. So I think NICE, the attacks on NICE are completely misplaced.
I disagree with you there.
Okay.
Well, you know more, but the attacks on NICE's existence are misplaced for that reason.
Yeah, some of them are ridiculous.
Yeah. But the problem that I have is I don't have a problem with NICE. I have a problem with a nudge unit. Because this is an undemocratic process of optimization, where those kinds of calculations.
Well, people throw that exact accusation of NICE, that's technocratic.
Yeah, but I don't have a problem with experts. I think we need more experts and more authority. Authority is good. Specialist authority is good. What I have a problem with is when it's not subject to democratic debate, and when it's tied to the workings of government, and when government's workings are tied to commercial interests, which is what's happening.
Yeah, we can all accept that.
So, certainly, it's sort of a feature I find interesting about NICE is that yes, you can say it's a sort of technocratic.
What's nice?
National Institute for Clinical Excellence. It's
they're the rational body for the NHS. So it's like, we have this new drug, it's fantastic, and it extends people's lives by 1 month. It costs £100,000 for the drug.
Yeah.
Or do you want 10 nurses for that £100,000?
Allocation of scarce resources.
Yes.
It's a maximization at a societal level, not at an individual level.
So sort of one of the features which they get criticised for very often is the use of the QALY, and so it's an explicitly utilitarian sort of model, or an explicitly utilitarian approach to allocation of resources. So they go and they say, how much is it going to cost using this particular intervention to save a year from someone's life? And they use that as the measure by which to decide whether or not drugs get approved. But what's interesting about them is that a lot of the mechanisms by which they try and make the decisions it's sort of open. They do try and have public consultations on whether or not they're going to use a particular decision model in order to make a particular decision. There's a lot of that from what I understand of NICE. Now maybe that's
that's, I suppose in theory that's correct, but you will have, because it's necessarily so complex,
right,
that you could definitely argue, certainly from, if you take a broader, we're not rational perspective, to tie it in with that.
Yes.
We're not rational, no, people off the street aren't rational enough to understand the models that we use. There's some models that we use that, like, I know the economists that use them, and it's like, it's at the very limits of your understanding.
Okay.
So in that sense, if you tie in the irrationality into that, there's a critique there.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, yes, you have been wanting to say something?
I just ask you a question, and I'm sorry if I misunderstood. I think you said before that you'd like to see sort of recognising that people are irrational rather than exploiting it for big business, that it could be used for sort of common good. If I hope I'm right on. Yeah, okay, so I was wondering how you thought its role could be in sort of climate change, energy, like, making people more use less, because sort of I'm still reading about all this, but it seems that it's not enough just to move to solar panels or whatever. We still need to sort of reduce our own usage. So I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really my area, but I suppose I accept that we are irrational. That's that's true, or whatever you want to call it. And I suppose there's work to be done. Other people know more about this than me, but trying to understand psychology in relation to denial about making changes that will benefit the environment. That is good. I mean, I suppose it's interesting. There's interesting discussions to be had about environmentalism in terms of, we were talking about Jonathan Dawson, who can't be here. Has an interesting point to make about what is in our benefit. Is our benefit actually ultimately to avoid climate change rather than our short-term benefits? So it's about changing our understanding of what is in our interests. I think there's also interesting discussions to be had about environmentalism in terms of, is environmentalism an ideology, or is it in fact another kind of technocratic issue of optimization, and it's a pragmatic issue. So there's no kind of ideological debate to be had there. But that's kind of not really what you're asking. So I don't know. I think there's important work to be done in terms of accepting that we're creatures of habit and trying to therefore find environmental policies that take account of that. So I think work is being done in that area. But
just to expand on my points a little bit. Like, I don't know if people know about the rebound effect, but as it is that as a country gets more energy efficient, so the more energy it can get per pound, the more energy it uses. So that's why potentially it's not enough just to sort of go green, but it also requires using less and how do you do
I think also just to something I thought of, which is that the problem I think that we have is that corporations have cottoned on to our environmental desires and the environmental imperative, but the kind of massive expansion of greenwash and sort of corporate social responsibility and all these kinds of forms of bullshit, are are really exploiting our own irrationality in terms of, we do some kind of gesture about, some carbon trading thing, and yet we still fly to the States, but we feel better, and that's another form of irrationality, that greenwash and corporations are absolutely exploiting. So there's a fight to be had there.
I just want to add to the point about the business exploiting irrationality. One of the biggest example of irrationality is the subprime lending saga.
Is there
subprime?
Lending
Yes,
saga
yeah.
In the States,
Yeah.
we all know what happened there, and now millions of homeowners in America are being kicked out of their homes because they took on debts that they could not pay back, which is clearly an example of irrationality. And also many banks, they thought that they were so smart that they piled up lots and lots of credit for swapping debt, but at the end of the day, they became very toxic and they had to be bailed out by governments. And had they been rational, they wouldn't have piled up too much debt on the balance sheet. But I will also briefly add to the previous debate between the gentleman over here and you, that I have nothing against economics to become more scientific. I only have reservation against economics to become more like a cold science. So in 1974, the famous physicist Richard Feynman coined this term cold science to refer to practices that have the semblance of being scientific, but do not in fact follow the scientific method. So economics try to become more like physics, but it's not as empirical or as experimental as physics.
Yeah.
And also add to that gentleman's point that economic methodology, which is the field that study philosophy and history of economics, is well and alive. But the only trouble is that it's neither taught to undergraduates nor researched by academics. Right. And it makes economics unique in the social sciences because it is the only social sciences that consider its history irrelevant.
Right.
Its philosophy irrelevant. Because economists thought that they have found this model, the ultimate economic model, and therefore it's right. It is right for all the time.
Right.
And therefore, I think that a better economics would be not shy to critically examine its philosophy, its philosophical foundation, and its history, as well as open to contribution from other sciences, history, philosophy, politics, sociology, physics, so on and so forth, as well as from economists who have a different view, so that we can sort of become more interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary.
Brilliant. Camilla?
Yeah, I think there's a danger in the way that we're talking about economics, in that we maintain this benevolence that it has and the authority that it has. It's like we talk about economics in the way that it's this thing which from the bottom up is permeated into culture and into politics, and when we try and disaggregate that power and make economics something different, then it spins off and it goes into the development department, and it goes into, I'm a geographer, so it goes into geography department. And I think that sometimes when we're talking about it as a discipline, we need to think about how we deconstruct the power of the discipline at the same time as working out what the discipline should become. Because the assumptions about what it means to be an economist, and I'll joke, I work in climate change and we joke about it all the time, well, you won't be able to do that because you're not an economist yet, or whatever. Right. And I think we have to kind of think about those assumptions of what economics is and what the authority of economics, and saying, authority can be useful for breaking some things down or whatever, question it as you will, but it's not this magic thing that's permeated through. There's been the politics which have made assumptions about economics, which has made economics strong. There's been cultural assumptions that have been made about economics that have made it strong. So I think when we challenge how we learn about economics, we also need to challenge the value of it as a cultural thing in lots of different sectors and stuff.
Okay.
I think it's partly because of I don't know if anyone's read the Lewis Powell thing it's this basically it's like the 70s, and this guy wrote to the who's about to join the Supreme Court. I can't remember, but he basically wrote this thing to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It's a sort of secret, confidential memo. You can find it online. Though. It's quite, it's well known now. But it basically says how big business needs to start defending its interests because it was apparently quite under assault from sort of left-wing views back then. And then he says one of the main things is that we need to capture universities. And he talks about how, and the way he describes it is putting forward the right-wing view because all that's being talked about is the left-wing view. So we need to start sponsoring people to university professorships who are sympathetic to us, and I don't know if the same thing happened in the I don't know if there was a memo or whatever in the UK, but it's not like history where it's not for example profitable for someone to pay a load of money to a professor to promote the view that whatever you want to argue from the 19th century, how far was Henry VIII influenced by Thomas Wolsey? Like, no one cares, and it's not going to make anyone any money.
Yeah.
So I don't know how you can break the stranglehold of when economics is clearly something that's very powerful in our current society. I don't know how you can break the stranglehold of people people basically paying for it to be neoliberal.
Okay.
I'm aware it's at the sort of pub time on the agenda. So does anyone have strong objections to me saying something vaguely concluding sounding? Is that okay? But I guess I wanted to say before we go, feel free to help yourself some more food. Sign up to the email sheet there for getting more updates on stuff, and have a look at our literature table and come to the pub. I was going to suggest the Brie Louise, which is just across Euston Road, and it's very nice. And the thing I was going to say at the end is, I guess, some strategies for moving forwards for breaking the power of rubbish economics is, I guess, a lot of the time we've seen, it seems to be becoming mainstream, this bringing reality into economics, and that's a really useful strategy. We can have that kind of calls out the inconsistencies, and it's been used quite a lot, and I think that's done a lot of good. But actually, I think that's kind of what we've been discussing today, is taking it to the next level and calling out what claims to be a descriptive discipline as a normative discipline, and kind of saying that this discipline, it's got a fixed image of the world that it's working towards, as you expressed very well at the beginning. And we've got to say, actually, you're working towards this fixed picture of the world, and change the language in which we can challenge it. And by bringing ideology in, there's a very good book on the table called The Rhetoric of Economics, and I'm saying those tools of economics are rhetoric, just like history and all the other social science disciplines. And we've got to be able to challenge it in whatever language we like. When someone says to you, austerity is inevitable, you need to be able to challenge it in, well, it's not right to treat someone like that. Not just saying, well, it's 5% more, this, that, or the other. And I guess there's a very pertinent quote which I'd like to end on, which comes from someone who is addressing the bourgeoisie in this quote, so you might be able to guess who it is. And he says to the bourgeoisie, "The selfish misconception that induces you to transform into eternal laws of nature and of reason, the social forms springing from your present mode of production and form of property, historical relations that rise and disappear in the progress of production, this misconception you share with every ruling class that has preceded you. What you see clearly in the case of ancient property, what you admit in the case of feudal property, you're of course forbidden to admit in the case of your own bourgeois form of property." So that has very resounding.
Yeah. Brilliant note to end on. Thank you. And thank you, Eliane.